Warning: this episode contains details that some listeners may find disturbing. Freddy Krueger, the killer from A Nightmare on Elm Street with blades for fingers, who preys on your dreams and ensures death in your sleep. What if I told you that Freddy is based on a true story? That he was born from a haunting wave of real deaths where people were dying in their dreams? In the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, something strange began to happen in America. Dozens of young men, healthy, vibrant immigrants from Southeast Asia, began dying in their sleep. And they didn't die of violence or infection or disease. The press gave this a name that played on people's fears and perhaps prejudice: Asian death syndrome. Meanwhile, medical researchers scrambled for answers. What follows is true horror, one that stalks the night, strikes the young, and its medical name is Sudden Unexplained Nocturnal Death Syndrome. This is the terrifying true story that inspired A Nightmare on Elm Street. Stay with us to the end, because only then will you understand the full truth about the nightmare that kills. This is a study of strange. And welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Michael, back from a handful of weeks for a summer vacation where I still feel like I need a vacation from my vacation, but that's the way it goes. So let's get into today's strangeness. Many horror fans know A Nightmare on Elm Street, the movie released in 1984, made by the man, the myth, the legend, Wes Craven, the director behind The Hills Have Eyes, Scream, etc., etc. But few know that Craven was inspired by a Los Angeles Times report in 1981, which is about Hmong and Laotian refugees in America, men in their 20s and 30s, who refused to sleep, terrified of nightmares. One carried pots of coffee to stay awake, another begged his mother, "Don't let me sleep." Yet when sleep finally came, he died screaming. Craven said that this was the kernel of Elm Street, the fear that falling asleep would kill you. And he layered it in with dream logic, and Freddy Krueger was born, a character that frightened me so much when I was growing up, but yet I couldn't stop from renting the movies over and over again. But what caused these real deaths? And that's where the mystery and the real horror begins. We tend to think that once something is named, it becomes less frightening. Giving a thing a label should offer clarity, control, order, but in this case, naming this deadly sleep syndrome didn't make it go away. In the spring of 1981, medical examiner Dr. Friedrich Eckner stood over the body of a young Hmong man who had died in his sleep. And there was no trauma, no drugs, no physical abnormality to explain why this man in his prime, who had just been hanging out and laughing with his family the evening before, simply never woke up. It wasn't the first case Eckner had seen. Across California, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Bronx, there were multiple victims. The pattern was eerily consistent. Young men, all relatively arrived from Southeast Asia, mostly Hmong, Lao, and Vietnamese, all reportedly healthy, all dead by morning. And in nearly every case, someone in the household said that they had heard the victim cry out, groan, or even scream just moments before the silence. They were dying in the dark, and no one could say why. Multiple doctors and organizations eventually studied this. The CDC formally launched an investigation into what they began calling Sudden Unexplained Nocturnal Death Syndrome, or SUNDS for short. In some reports, this is abbreviated even shorter, SUDS, Sudden Unexplained Death Syndrome, but SUNDS, and with my accent I might not be saying that clear enough for everybody, but SUNDS became the more formalized version in clinical literature. And Asian death syndrome is the layman term for it back in the early 80s. According to the CDC's Morbidity and Mortality Weekly report, at least 13 Hmong men had died this way from 1977 to 1981. And that's a small percentage of the total because not all cases were sent to the CDC. But they examined everything about these cases: the men's diets, their mattresses, their bedroom temperatures, even the insulation of their homes, but nothing stood out. They conducted extensive autopsies. They ruled out infectious diseases, foul play, and environmental toxins. One investigator called the phenomenon a diagnosis of exclusion. In other words, when all other possible causes are eliminated, only the unexplained remains. There is one interesting / strange clue, though. The deaths all occurred between midnight and 6 a.m., and many of the victims' families described episodes of sleep paralysis, groaning, gasping, and then silence. Just death in the night. But if you spoke to the families, especially the elders, they didn't call it a syndrome. They called it something much older, something darker. They called it Dabsog. Dabsog in Hmong folklore is a malevolent night spirit. It comes into the home while you sleep. It sits on your chest, presses down on your breath. It paralyzes you with fear and slowly crushes the life from your body. The Hmong believed it attacked those whose spirits were vulnerable, those who lacked protection, especially young men who had not received the full ceremonial blessings or were separated from their ancestral lands. The Hmong were displaced people, initially immigrating to Southeast Asia from China. Then after aiding the United States in the Vietnam War and the Civil War in Laos, thousands fled their homeland to escape retribution. They arrived in America culturally fractured, without their spiritual leaders, without their rituals, separated from their ancestral lands. To the Hmong, the answer was simple. These men were unprotected, and the spirits were angry. A quick interjection. I've spoken about sleep paralysis in a number of other episodes. I'm sure people are relatively familiar with it. It's very interesting to see this connection between sleep paralysis and this belief of a malevolent spirit that sits on you and presses down on your breath. Even in Western cultures, we find a lot of myths and folklore around what's actually happening during sleep paralysis. And back in Southeast Asia, the Hmong were not alone in this belief. In the Philippines, there's a word, bangagut, and it literally means to rise and moan in sleep. The word has roots in Tagalog, and though it's often translated very loosely as nightmare, it refers to more than just a bad dream. A bangagut is believed to be a type of malevolent spirit or fate that overtakes a person in sleep, causing them to convulse and then die. The belief in bangagut is especially potent in rural areas where death in sleep is sometimes attributed to SUNDS, or a type of spiritual imbalance. And in many accounts, bangagut is said to strike men who eat too much before bed, who drink alcohol excessively, or who defy moral codes. Here again, science overlaps with folklore. Modern researchers have found that large meals, alcohol, and REM sleep irregularities can all trigger fatal arrhythmias in individuals with underlying heart conditions like Brugada syndrome, a genetic disorder now very closely associated with SUNDS. And just like in the Hmong cases, bangagut almost always affects young, seemingly healthy males, mostly between the ages of 20 and 40. And then there's Thailand, where the syndrome goes by a different name, Lai Tai. Lai Tai means death during sleep. It's not framed quite as supernaturally as Dabsog or bangagut, but the underlying cultural anxiety is similar. In some Thai regions, Lai Tai is associated with spiritual imbalance or even sorcery. In fact, there is a concept of spirits that can cause sudden illness or death. If someone dies in their sleep under mysterious circumstances, the cause is often attributed to an angry or unsettled spirit. However, researchers who studied cases in Lai Tai in the 1990s and early 2000s confirmed that it mirrors SUNDS almost exactly in age, gender, and time of death. In all three regions, and among three groups, the story ends the same way. A young man cries out in his sleep and is never heard from again. But are these stories just superstitions? Or do they hold clues that science has only recently begun to understand? Some doctors began to look deeper, not just at the deaths themselves, but the idea of sleep as a battleground, the very mechanics of REM cycles, the role of adrenaline, the vulnerability of the human heart when it's no longer guarded by consciousness. So, is SUNDS a myth, medicine, or this marriage of both? Theory number one is that this is related to a genetic heart disorder, Brugada syndrome, or, I have to say a very big word here. Let me see if I can get this out right. Ion channelopathies. Ooh, I think I did okay on my first take there. Lurk silently until a trigger, stress, REM sleep, large meal, triggers a fatal arrhythmia. Sudden arrhythmic death syndrome, SADS, is sudden and unexpected death of adolescents and adults caused by cardiac arrest. Theory 2 is that cultural stress and isolation can lead to death. Anthropologists have theorized that the trauma and spiritual disconnection of dispersed refugees amplified fear with these beliefs, triggering physiological stress strong enough to precipitate death. Theory 3 is that sleeplessness itself can be deadly. Many victims stayed awake for nights in terror, and then they crashed into sleep. Because of this, there's a REM imbalance, sometimes enough to flip a susceptible heart. Theory 4 is that dietary triggers can contribute to death during sleep. Cases in the Philippines link SUNDS to heavy meals and alcohol before bed, possibly triggering Brugada arrhythmias. Wes Craven heard these stories. He saw the headlines. He read about families who begged their sons to stay awake, only to find them dead in bed. And these nightmare-driven deaths ignited his imagination. He blended this real dread, this real terror, and dreamscape logic to unleash Freddy Krueger, a supernatural entity born from real terror, a perfect representation of Dabsog, Brugada syndrome, and other folklore and beliefs. So, where are we in terms of what actually killed these men? Well, in my opinion, it's not just one thing, but a storm of different things. Genetic predisposition, cultural shifts in terror, trauma, sleeplessness. You all know me, I'm a skeptic about pretty much everything, even though I love all the strange mysteries the world has to offer. But the power of belief is something I, believe. So is SUNDS a collision of biology and belief? Their bodies betrayed them in the dead of night. Their minds haunted them with invisible spirits, and in that darkness, their hearts stopped. Freddy Krueger may be fictional, but nightmares have killed. If you go to bed tonight and fear a ghost in the dark in the shadows of the room, remember this. Sometimes nightmares are more than fiction. Sometimes they're fatal. Thank you for listening to A Study of Strange. It felt good to brush off the cobwebs after taking some time off. If you're new to the show, take a quick second and hit that subscribe. Leave a rating and review. It goes a long way to helping the show. Next week, you're not going to want to miss this. I'm bringing on my young son to talk to me about something that he wanted to bring up, which is UFOs. So I'm going to share some accounts with him that he's not aware of, and hopefully it doesn't keep him up at night.